Well, that passage sounds a little transactional, doesn't it? Hey, if you do this, I'll give you this. Oh, this is an interesting passage. I had to really dissect some of this because there's a lot of, like, American folk religion is heavily influenced by Christianity, but isn't necessarily like what Christianity is. And growing up in fundamentalism, there is an emphasis on you're a sinner, right? You're a sinner and you're worthless and there's nothing you can do about it and it's only because of God. And that is very unhealthy thinking, by the way. It causes a lot of psychological harm in a lot of people. And there's actually now a new branch of psychology developing where psychologists are becoming very experts in religious trauma because those types of thoughts can actually cause psychological harm in people. But then you can swing the pendulum the other way and not look at the problems that we face and that we have. And so this idea of, like, I'm not worth anything and God's worth everything is not really that biblical if you look at it. Do you remember the seesaws when you were a kid? Like the seesaws, you're on a seesaw going back and forth. When I was a kid, I had my friend Gary. He was a very tall guy. I was a very short kid, believe it or not. Believe it or not, I was short and pudgy until about 10th grade. And then I watched all my friends do this. Whoa, what happened? I just stretched all the way out. I don't know what it was. But in elementary school, I was rather short. I know, it's hard to think of that now. But I was short, and my friend Gary was very tall. And he looked like, we were in 4th grade, and he looked like he was in high school. He was like that big of a kid, even though his age and my age matched. He was as big. And what I really liked about Gary is the bullies on the playground didn't bother me when I was hanging out with Gary, because Gary was bigger than all the bullies on the playground. But one thing I didn't like to do with Gary was the seesaw. There's a little picture of what that might look like. Right? Have you ever been on a seesaw and it wasn't like a good match? And you're just like, this is no fun. You're either like in the air or you're on the ground. You know, when you're a parent, you have your kids and they're like little and they're hanging on for dear life and you got to like push off the ground and give them something because they're not going to bring you at all. They're not going to take you up. So you have to do all the work on one end, right? Now, theologically, when we really hone in on one side of the sin-glory spectrum, it can either side can cause a lot of damage. When you hone in on the sin side, and we're sinners, and only God's grace, and there's nothing worthy in me, and some like fundamentalist Calvinist place will take that and you're totally depraved. There is nothing good in you at all, and God's the only thing that put anything good in you, and then love the good that God put in you. And then other people God just didn't bother with. And that whole theological spectrum is like that elephant on the seesaw with the mouse on the other side saying, all right, we're kind of top heavy. But then you get on the other side and you don't look at your inner life. You don't look at the things that you struggle with and you just want to look away or pretend or just, there has to be some kind of a balance between looking at the ways that we are broken as individuals, but not adopting that into our value. You have no value as a human being because there's brokenness to you, right? Have you ever had an antique that was cracked or that needed some repair? Did you take the antique and then toss it in the dumpster? If it's been in your family for a while, you want to do some repair work on it. So we have to understand that God has made us, and before anything bad happens in the story of the Bible, God says everything I made is good. And then God looks at the humans that God created and said, these humans are very good. And then you read the rest of the Old Testament and you're like, but really? Are you sure about that? You're reading the news and you're watching your feeds, you're like, I don't know about this very good thing. But we do have to understand that there is a balance between our brokenness and our value. between understanding that there's goodness to us, and then there's areas that need some work and attention. And having a proper understanding of those things, keep that seesaw kind of moving back and forth. And it makes you healthy. Now, if you have an overemphasis on the sin of yourself, you're going to read this verse with those glasses on. I got these new glasses, by the way. These are really fun glasses, and they have these magnet sunglasses that just snap right on. I think that Dumbledore made them magic, because I just and they just like snap on, and I have sunglasses again. They're magical. I love them, and then I just take them off, and I'm done. It's really cool. I like them, by the way. But when I put those on, it tints everything around me, right? So we all have glasses that we use to like see the world and perceive the world. That's how we see things. Now, if you get a scratch on your glasses, or if there's a fingerprint or a smudge or some debris, but the worst for me is when I'm cooking burgers. You know, there's a lot of grease that like snapping, and then the grease somehow, how do you make grease aerosol? I don't know. But it like goes up, and then this like coats my glasses. And then everything looks like I have cataracts or something. I'm like, I can't see. Hold on, I gotta clear my throat. I was drinking my tea, it went down the wrong way. So these glasses kind of influence how we see the world. And if there's something on our glasses, it's gonna really mess with how we're seeing things. You can be looking in the sky and there's a patch on your glasses. You're like, oh, there's something in the sky. No, there's not. It's on your glasses. So if we have this overemphasis on we are worthless and God is everything, kind of an understanding of us and God, we're going to read this with that understanding and say, oh, look, I'm nothing. There is nothing good about me. The only thing that's good about me is that I'm connected to God. And I am worthless and God is everything. Which is actually not very biblical. It's not a part of the Bible's story. It's a part of American folk religion, I think, that we have just kind of worked its way in. And it's kind of bled into American culture with, religious culture. But there's the thing, like there's some branches here. Some of them aren't doing so well, so they get cut off and they're thrown in the fire and they're burned up. And it just sounds like really like threats, passive aggressive threats, and it sounds like transactions. Like you hold this, it's like you got to produce some fruit or else you're going to be thrown in the fire. And that's because we have these glasses on with the overemphasis on the sin aspect of us. So let's take those glasses off and say that we have equal amounts of sin and glory in us because God made us very good. And yes, we are broken individuals that need some help. And that's where grace comes in. And we have a better balance of those things. And then we reread this passage with something else. And you find out, what I noticed is that there are branches. Ever notice that in this passage? There are branches being trimmed off. There's some plural stuff happening here. He says this, I am the true vine and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will bear even more fruit. You are already clean because the word I have spoken to you. There's some interesting things going on here. Now, first of all, there's branches, plural. So it's not that we're looking out at a crowd and saying, well, there's someone bearing good fruit, so we'll keep them, and there's someone not bearing good fruit. Let's snip them off the community, throw them in the fire. And it's not an individual, who's up to no good and who's doing the good. Because if we have that reading, then we're into this transactional, like God is holding a carrot in front of us saying, well, you better. That's not how love works. Instead, there are branches in you that are bearing fruit, and there are branches in you that aren't bearing fruit. And God is this gardener. Have you met a gardener? Gardeners are amazing. They can do amazing things. They grow food and then they eat it. It's amazing. And the care that goes into the growing of the food, the care that goes into caring for the plant. There is no passive aggressiveness like people looking at the tomato plant saying, well, you better, or else I'm going to throw. That tomato plant doesn't know any better, right? It's just that there's all this work in the gardener. It's like, I got to help this plant with everything it needs. Well, there's there's a branch, and there's certain pruning techniques. I am not a gardener. I'm not going to pretend to be a gardener and fool you into thinking I am one. But there are pruning techniques that you can do on tomatoes and grapes and different things that help you get a better... I got to figure out how to prune my apple tree at home because it's just getting really like big and not a lot of apples come out of there. So I got to figure that out. I want to talk with Heather afterwards. She's saying, I know how to do that. So when this passage here is not a dismissal of a value of an individual who's not up to snuff. This passage here is not saying, well, you're a bad branch, we better throw you in the fire. Oh, there's a good branch because you're obeying all the rules. This has nothing to do with that. There are things in us that are bearing fruit, and there are things in us that are not. And those unhealthy branches, they can pull the energies from what we're really good at and what we're supposed to be about. And instead of bearing good fruit, it's sending all of this energy to like a rogue branch that just has leaves on it and nothing. And you know one of the biggest ways we do this is doom scrolling. You ever get into doom scrolling? Doom scrolling is like you pick up your phone, you open up some kind of app, and then all of a sudden, like 45 minutes later, you're like, oh my gosh, I gotta make dinner. Has anybody else done that? Like our brains just can get sucked into that, right? And it takes a lot of energy from what else we could be doing. Now, does that mean you're a horrible person if you're doing that? No, we're not talking about that. It just means that you have diverted some energies that could have been used for something good into something that was maybe not so great. No fruit came out of that. Maybe you got a little bit of what do they call it? A distraction for a while. And distractions sometimes are needed. Let me tell you, distractions and diversions can help. But if our life is full of only distractions, then we're sending all these energies to branches in our life that aren't going to give us anything on the other side of it. I mean, how many times have I been doom scrolling on my Facebook app, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, I could have read a book or something. Like I could have done something interesting with my life at this point. And so we're talking about those kinds of things. And then there's different varying levels of how bad stuff can get and how minor stuff can be, right? But it's all about pruning the branches in you that aren't really giving you anything in your life and trying to get something better out of it. Because I'm sure all of us do not have the idealized version of the life we want, right? Like, if you do, let's switch places, because maybe tell me how you did that. But we don't have the idealized, like if we close our eyes and this is how we envision life to be, right? Like not all of us have that reality, right? Most of us don't. And so how can we get a better version of the life we're living? This is what God's after in this passage. And God is the gardener. It's not up to you. It is not up to you to try and figure out your entire life and arrange everything. God is the gardener and you are a branch. Now, some might say, well, yeah, Jesus is the vine and I'm just a branch, right? I'm just a stinking little branch. Did you know that a branch is also the vine? You don't look at the tree and there's a branch coming off and be like, well, that's useless. Does anybody ever do that? No. But we will look at ourselves, we'll read this passage with the overemphasis on sin, and we will look at this passage and say, I'm just a branch. God is the vine, and I'm just some measly little branch. There's nothing special here. Nothing happening here. And we don't do that with anything else within the sphere of agriculture. We don't look at, all those burning bushes that are around the church here. We don't be like, well, look at all these stupid branches. Like, these are stupid. I'd rather see the trunk of this shrub. Nope, not going to work. Right? You don't look at the trees and be like, well, that's dumb. Look at all those stupid branches. The trees make the thing. Like the trees, the branches can't support themselves without the trunk, but it's not about the trunk. The branches are the things that will actually hold the fruit. And Jesus is trying to tell his disciples, like, yes, I'm a vine. I am feeding you the energies to bear fruit out in the world. And Jesus is kind of preparing us for that moment of crucifixion and death and resurrection and then ascension, where he's not present physically with the disciples anymore, and then the sending of the Spirit at Pentecost to say, now I'm going to fill you with the life of God to go live out love in the world. And that is what we're trying to get at. It's not us, oh, I'm a stupid little branch, there's nothing good about me, but God is the vine. It's not about the vine. The branch and the vine are connected together as one thing. You see how that works? It's not about, oh, I'm just a little branch. There is honor in being a branch that is connected to the vine. Psalm 8 actually is a beautiful psalm that is very scandalous if you read it, and some people don't like how scandalous it is, so they change the words. Some passages out of Psalm 8, they translate it this way: God has made us just a little bit lower than the angels. And we're talking like hierarchical kind of stuff, right? But if you actually look at other translations and the actual Hebrew, the word for angels is actually Elohim. Does anybody recognize that name? God has made us just a little bit lower than God. Holy smokes, that's right out of the Bible. That's Psalm 8. God has made us just a little bit lower than God. Wow, that doesn't really match my fundamentalist upbringing at all. That makes me uncomfortable to say I'm just a little bit lower than God. But there is so much language that says that God values us and all of creation so much that God is bringing us in and uniting us with who God is. And there's language that is really interesting in the early church where Athanasius says God became humans so humans can become God. It's like, okay, well, that's kind of heretical, right? Well, that person also gave us the doctrine of the Trinity, which is like pretty important. Athanasius, Saint Athanasius. And that's something that is hard to understand in our minds, that there is this union between us and God where there is like because of what Jesus has done, there is no distinguishing between God and us anymore. Because God has brought us in and united us to God. Is that what we experience in our actual lives? No, but that's how God treats us. Because God loves us so much. And so having this, oh, I'm just a dumb branch kind of a thing, it's like, oh no, the branch is a part of the vine. Now, if you're trimmed off of the vine, there's like not a lot of value to the branch, it's just a stick. But when you are connected to this vine, there is goodness there. Henry Nouwen, one of my favorite theologians, said this: when we lose ourselves in God's love, we find ourselves as branches of the true vine. We discover our true identity in God. So you are a branch in the very being of God. Okay, that is not just some language that's like, well, I'm just the vine, or I'm just the branch and God is the vine. There's nothing special about me. Like, no, you're connected to the vine. You're part of the vine. You're united to the vine. And you are what bears fruit in the world. And the vine just sends you that energies and life force to live out love in the world. And then the next part of this phrase says, remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Okay, apart from me. Well, with the previous information, how do we understand this passage now? Apart from me, you can do nothing. It sounds like there is like this call to vigilance happening. Like you got to stay vigilant and be aware that if you like part from God in any way, shape, or form, if by doing anything bad or something, then you are outside and no good and you can't do anything because it's all about God. And that's a very transactional understanding of this passage again. And if we're reading this passage with the understanding that, no, we're a part of the vine, we're as a branch, and there is like some glory that is representative here. It's not about a call to vigilance, like, so you better stay connected. If you don't stay connected, oh, you're in trouble, you're in trouble. That's not actually what's going on here. The opposite is what's going on here. The remain is just a passive thing. It's like, well, just remain in me, I'll remain in you. There is no like active vigilance that you got to do to make it so and happen so. Does the branch got to do anything to stay connected to the tree? Like, does it do anything? Is it like holding on for dear life and be like gritting its teeth and be like, oh my God, here comes the wind? No. The branch is just connected. It's a part. There is nothing you have to do to like stay connected. It's just a natural outflow of what the branch does. It's part of it. And it's not just going to fall off because it forgot to hang on. It grows out of and is like made of the same substance as the vine or the trunk itself. just a little bit smaller. This is not a call to vigilance. It's a call to do the authentic work that you were created to do in the first place. It's a call to be who you are. It's a call that is to remain in God as God has made you. And so what we read that and we get a little bit nervous, like, oh my gosh, I got to remain in the branch. I got to remain in the vine. I got to remain. How am I going to do that? What am I going to do? How am I going to do this? It causes spiritual anxiety, emotional anxiety. And then all of a sudden, we don't have any energy to actually do it because we're spending it all on anxiety to try and stay connected, which a branch doesn't actually do that. A branch just is. And so this remain is a passive thing. And the branch is just doing what branches do. You have been made to love. You were made for love, by love, in this world. And so that's your job. Your job is to love people as God loves. And so you have to experience God's love, and then you have to be a channel of God's love by experiencing it. It's like, oh, I know what this is like. Now I know how to love people because I've experienced love from God. But if you have that, I'm a branch, I gotta remain, I'm just gonna hold tight to this thing, you're not experiencing the love that God is. You are anxiously trying to not mess up. And there's a big difference. Have you ever been around somebody that you got to walk around eggshells? You're like, don't say this. It'll set them off. Don't ever mention that person because they have this, and it's totally awkward. And then you get around them and you're like, okay, let's not say anything. They might set off. God is not like that. That is not the way God is, and we don't have to interact with God as though we got to walk around eggshells and not mess up and just cling as tightly as you can. That's not it. This is a call to authentic work and spiritual rest. There's nothing you have to do to remain in God because it's just happening. Because you're a part of the vine. It is God's work as the gardener to do the work, and it is your job as the branch to receive the love that is coming your way. That's it. Is that so hard? Yes, by the way it is. You just have to be loved by God. That is really difficult, to just be loved. Henry Nouwen also said this: resting in God is not a passive state, but a dynamic surrender to God's will, allowing his life to flow through us. That's amazing. So this is a call to active rest. Oh, but then we got the trouble part of this passage. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up and thrown into the fire and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. Well, Lord have mercy. How are we going to read this one? If all the other stuff that we built on thus far is true, have you ever been burned by fire? I used to be a cook. And I was around fire quite a lot. There's a pan, and it had a metal handle. And the metal handle was over top of an open flame. And then someone came by and turned off the flame. And then they just kept on going. And I turn around and I see the handle to the pan that I need to grab with my bare hand. I got branded that day. It was weird. I watched my skin shrink. My hand was like open like this, and I was like, whoa, it like shrunk. That was a burn, right? Like experiencing fire, but that same fire is the fire that cooks things and made beautiful meals. Did you know that God's love is like a fire? Throughout the whole Bible, it mentions that God's love is like a fire. And how you experience fire determines how you're going to receive it. And so love is this call to vulnerability. Right? You ever been married for a little while? And at first you're like, you got your best suit on, your best dress on, your best everything, and you don't pass gas in front of each other because that would not be cool. And you're like, you have just like everything, you're like, everything, you're like on edge. And then you've been married for a couple decades, and it's like, I could just be me around you. This is great. That's a different kind of love, right? Because your love is deepening and it requires vulnerability. It requires you. And there have been hard times in your marriage where you didn't know if you was going to make it because it required a new level of vulnerability that you weren't ready to tackle, right? But love demands that you go there. Love demands that if you want to be go deeper with this individual, it requires vulnerability on both ends. And maybe the other person wasn't ready to be vulnerable and address their issues, and I'm sorry. Maybe you were ready, maybe you weren't ready, and I'm sorry. But that's love. Love is an experience of fire. Because when you're asked to be vulnerable in a way that is uncomfortable for you, that's still love. But boy, that can feel like a burn. It can feel like, this is hot right now because I've never shared this with anybody, and now all of a sudden we're here and I have to share the information. I have to tell you the story. I have to acknowledge my addiction. I have to, love brings you to places that you never wanted to admit or say or face again. Love unearths all of the baggage from the past, and it requires vulnerability and trust to get there. But boy, does that process feel like fire. And this is what God's love does. God's love is perfect and true. And you cannot pretend to be someone other than you are in the presence of pure love. Because pure love will just make you vulnerable. And this vulnerability feels like fire. It feels like burning. And that's why fire is also a purifying symbol in the Old Testament, where they'll take precious metals and they'll melt it down. And then any garbage that's mixed up in there will float to the surface. And then the metallurgist will scoop them off, and then they'll have a pure gold bar. Love is like this fire. And it requires vulnerability to be, and God is pure love and perfect love and true love. And to be in that presence can feel like a fire. So the presence of God is a fire of love. Our experience of that fire will then dictate how we experience that fire. Whether it's a little bit hot and burning, or whether it is something that's going to make something beautiful. And it is all about, are we willing to go there? Are we willing to be vulnerable? Are we willing to love? And God's a good gardener, and he takes us step by step, by step, by step. But this old saint of old, Meister Eckhart, he said this: in the fiery furnace of God's love, our fears and insecurities are consumed, and we are left with nothing but pure love and compassion. And so fire is the experience of God's love. It sounds like judgment. It sounds like punishment. But it's actually just the experience of love that purifies. And how we feel in the presence of something that demands vulnerability from us that we're a little bit uncomfortable with determines how we experience God's love in that moment. But I believe that we will eventually all become vulnerable enough to step into the pure love that God is. Because I have hope that God is just that good and that powerful and that gracious. And so, if it is true that God's love is not diminishing, is not demanding or demeaning, which it's true, by the way, how would you live today in a love that just is and that you have no power to influence? Well, that's a deep question. If that is true, what if it was true for everyone you met too? That they could experience God's love just like that. That God's love is never diminishing, demanding, or demeaning. How would that change your interactions with people? How would that change your interactions with yourself? And how would that change your interactions with God? That you don't have to be on eggshells around God. Because God's love is not diminishing, it is not demanding, and it is not demeaning. God's love connects us to God. It purifies us so that we can be there and be comfortable. And it empowers us to then live that love out in the world. That's what Pentecost is all about. Receiving the Spirit of God to live love in the world. So today's benediction is Psalm 22, retold by modern poet Malcolm Guite. And he says this: before he shares with us the golden crown, he comes to share with us the crown of thorns. Our hurts and hates close in and hem him round. Mock and humiliate him. All the scorns with which we blaspheme God in one another are concentrated here among the horns of unicorns, the lions' mouths that slather of our devouring wickedness. He takes it all and turns it into love. He gathers all of us and by atonement makes our peace with God. He speaks to us of mercy Even as we pierce him, no one slakes his thirst. I tremble at the mystery, for Christ himself is crying through this psalm to suffer my own dereliction for me. Psalm 22, retold by Malcolm Guite.